Thanks for coming. Today I'll be talking about freshwater values in Hawaii and how we can model them in terms of their uh, impact on them, and then responses concerning these values. So the problem is that, as you all know, there are climate and land cover change happening, and they are impacting our water quantity and quality in uncertain and dramatic ways. But models to actually predict them are still underdeveloped. And another problem is we do have multiple users of these water resources. So how do we solve this problem? So I am proposing, and my research is we are doing a research so that for an effective water management, we need to understand the potential behavior or policy changes of these stakeholders to how would they respond to these extreme circumstances in terms of climate and land use change. I would like to talk about how important water is and what are its benefits. Water is critical for supporting life and human well-being. For provisioning, it provides us with fresh water. In this case here, I'm talking about agricultural farming operations. It also provides us with flood mitigation. In this case, showing you wetland ecosystem service. It controls the flow of water so that we won't have floods. And it also has another benefit called cultural service, especially in Hawaii, is it's required for we need a constant flow of fresh water for growing taro, and it also have supporting service. Supporting service is basically in terms of a water cycle. It's supporting all these three other services and the benefits we get from them. But as we all know, and also shown here is a decline trend in precipitation across all the main Hawaiian islands here. So basically what they're saying is all of these precious water resources are declining. And so I would like to say, how do we manage it? How can we manage? I'm proposing that we need to know more about the stakeholders that are using these resources, and I'm going to present four different stakeholders and how they value these resources. For example, from water resources managers' point of view, in ancient Hawaii, we do have this Maukatu Makai system of ahupuar, but in modern days, we do have because of the governance change and land use land cover change, we do have a different system. We do have state agencies like Commission on Water Resources, Department of Health for protection policies, state needs by the Department of Agriculture and DLNR, and also we do manage at the county level. These agencies, they are more interested how do we supply and meet the demands of the growing population, the changing climate and land use. From conservation point of view, they are more concerned about how can we improve the water quantity and quality by doing conservation, by fencing, or by planting trees along the coastline to reduce erosion. Also, we do have another stakeholders like agriculturalists or farmers. Since ancient Hawaii, agriculture has been a way of life. And we do have, local farmers that they have to depend on water, and they do have, so for them, they are managing water so that they have enough water here now as well as in the future, as well as there is less runoff from the farming operations. We also have cultural practitioners. Local believe that the energy of Kane, the Hawaiian god, is still flowing in the fresh water. So this is a culturally important value from a local perspective. And also another example of taro is it is something that we grow together and we teach to the younger generation. It is something that we share together, and it has culturally important social values. So what's the goal of my research is to develop a modeling tool so that we can evaluate these hydrologic ecosystem services, the services that we get from the nature for optimal water allocation between these stakeholders and for so that we will have, depending on equitable management actions. And the two study sites I chose are in Maui, and especially in West Maui. The one in the back, Wahikuli to all the way to Honolulu is in the leeward, and Iau Valley is in the windward side of the island. So what I'm trying to answer from this research is, what are the differences in these stakeholder values when it comes to freshwater? How are they handling, or how do they perceive so that they would handle these extreme changes? And in terms of policy, what are the perceptions on, for example, inflow stream standards, which control the flow of water? These are the standards for along the stream. And also, what's the difference between leeward and windward stakeholders' values? The method is first running a hydrological model, and then describing them in an FCM. FCM stands for fuzzy cognitive mapping. And then finally, suggesting some mitigation and adaptation strategies. I'll go into detail for all these three steps. The first step, I'll be running a hydrological model based on IPCC scenarios, climate change, which is downscaled to local scenarios. IPCC stands for International Panel on Climate Change. They produced a report in 2013. So basically, these are globally average temperature increase in terms of energy units. I am using the most intense scenario, 8.5. So we are expected to see that much level of energy increase at the end of the century. Depending on this, based on this scenario, I'm using, for example, precipitation. This is the current trend, a long-term average. This is what the anomaly, basically this is the reduction in precipitation from light red, almost pink, to dark red. Dark red means that the highest decrease in precipitation. This is the precipitation I'm planning to use for my hydrological model. For a land use land cover, it's from a Pacific Research Project. This is for a current condition, I'm planning to use 2010. This is the future condition. The difference is these red areas are alien species. They are based on USGS population model. They are predicting that we expect to see this much expansion of alien forests, and there would be the developed regions also would be in the dark gray colors that would be developed in Maui. These are the two scenarios. Using these scenarios, I will be running a watershed model. In fact, I have run at least some of the scenarios. After that, I will be describing them in FCM modeling. What does FCM stand for? FCM is basically our mental maps in our mind. How do we perceive certain things? For example, if we have node A and B, they are connected by this causal relationship by one of these levels of 7 levels of strength between these two. For example, if we have water quantity, we expect that, we do believe that an increase in water quality will support an increase in freshwater flora and fauna. But we do expect, and we have current studies that suggest that increase in sedimented nutrients will decrease the freshwater small fish and crabs. So how are we collecting these models, which is the values of stakeholders? First, from literature review and initial interviews, we draft models and then revise it from a larger survey across West Maui. So this is the first step. In the far left, we have these model inputs into the hydrological model. It will give up these three in terms of stream flow, sediments, and nutrients. They are further connected to how the ecosystem react to these changes in terms of sediment and nutrient retention. How do they affect the water quality and quantity? And how can we mitigate using the conservation practices in terms of controlling feral ungulates and invasive species, as well as putting in place like rain gardens and adding additional stressors like population. This is what an uh, FCM looks like from a conservation point of view. This is an example. The method is, the interviews are still being developed. So this is what the scenario looked like. If you were to assume that there's a decrease in precipitation, increase in sediment and nutrients, and in a change in land use land cover, we would expect these water quantity to decrease a lot, and also water quality will decrease. So it tells us how the ecosystem as a system changes if we were to perceive these stressors on the ecosystem. So we have done these two steps, hydrological modeling, FCM. The third step would be with strategies. So it would look like something like, how do we plan for future water quality and quantity needs? How do we increase and coordinate conservation actions? And before I thank, so basically we are developing 4 different stakeholders. So there would be at least 4 different FCM maps, and we are going to compare and contrast how do these values differ, and how can we use that to inform policy change and mitigation strategies. And I would like to thank the NOAA Sea Grant and also Hanauma Bay Education Program, especially Mihailani, who organized all these, and the staff who made it possible, and my lab members. And these are some of the references I used. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks for coming today, folks. I want to talk to you rather than about a very specific project that I've been doing over the last few years of my graduate school. I want to give you a little bit of an overview, kind of an idea. What are the several projects that Sea Grant has been funding me to do? And they all lead to this question of, can coral reefs, like our reef here in the Bay, survive the next few decades? I'm sure everyone here recognizes this. This is, of course, Waikiki. And whatever you think about Waikiki, no doubt it is an important economic engine for the state. And we've got all these really expensive hotels and buildings, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars invested into this area. It drives a lot of our economy. And we also have things out in the ocean like storms, occasionally a tsunami, things like that. And in between, this coral reef that absorbs a lot of the energy from those incoming waves and impacts and things like that. So what is the value of absorbing 90% of the incoming energy of a wave? Hundreds of millions of dollars right here. And that's just for one building. Huge economic value there. This is, of course, Nika. You can see the moats there. Best beach on the island, in my personal opinion, but it's got this beautiful soft white sand. That soft white sand is produced from the shells and skeletons of organisms that live on a coral reef. Without a coral reef, you don't have white sand beaches. The sand washes away, dissolves away, and without them producing it, without this reef out here producing that white sand, there is no Nika beach anymore. So hugely culturally important, huge value to our tourism industry. They also reefs produce beautiful scenes like this, where we've got this big shoal of manini, which of course are cool to see while you're snorkeling and such. They're also great on the grill. So we eat them here, most folks, in a recreational sort of way. Not too many people in Hawaii would not have enough food to eat if we weren't able to catch fish from our reefs. But for hundreds of millions of people around the world, 500 million people in poor countries around the world, the difference between having a healthy coral reef that produces food like this and not having one is the difference between feeding your children or watching them starve. So hugely important for a lot of people around the world. And the bad news is half the world's coral is already gone. We've lost it within the last 50 years. So you can see from the late 70s to the early 2000s, and it continues about the same way. In the Caribbean, we went from about half of the reef was covered in live coral, which is a very healthy number, to down around 10%. So we've lost about 80% of the coral in the Caribbean over the last few decades. I think most folks have thought that the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, were doing a lot better, that the Caribbean was going to heck, but the Indo-Pacific was doing a lot better. And in fact, that's not true. So on the Great Barrier Reef from the mid 80s to more recently, they've lost half the coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef. And oftentimes we might think of the Great Barrier Reef, it's got so much protection, it's an icon of Australia and of the world, but obviously there are some really serious problems there. Most of what we have lost have been for these sorts of reasons. So sedimentation is when you tear up the land for agriculture, for buildings, whatever, and that mud and such washes into the ocean, smothers and kills things. Simple as that. Watershed pollution, coastal pollution, things like heavy metals, a big molasses spill like we had, what was that, last year, things like that, oil, urban runoff, you name it, all kinds of things like that. Physical damage from literally dredging up the reef and removing it. Overfishing, particularly of things like those manini, which allows seaweeds to overgrow and kill the corals. That's where at least a very large fraction of this decline has come from. It's killed half the world's corals. What we're really worried about right now and going into the future are climate change, or the warming of the climate, the warming of the ocean, and what's called ocean acidification. You can see here a photo from Molokini Crater, which is off of Maui. This is taken just over a month ago, and you'll see lots and lots of coral. Almost all of it has turned a ghostly white. Those corals are what we call bleached. So corals themselves are animals related to sea anemones or jellyfish or critters like that. They have inside their tissues symbiotic algae. When the water gets too hot, that symbiosis breaks down and they turn this white color because they've lost a lot of that symbiotic algae. So you see right through to tissues, you see the white skeletons. This happens in response to stress, particularly high temperature stress. This past summer, we've had bleaching all across Hawaii. We had bleaching last year. It is getting progressively worse and progressively worse as water temperatures around Hawaii and other places around the world get hotter. The bad news is what we're seeing now is just the tip of the iceberg of where we're going. In 30, 40 years, this sort of scene and these sort of temperatures are what we expect the average conditions to be, meaning that many years will be worse than this, even under the best case climate scenario. So a lot of folks have concluded that collapse of coral reefs within our lifetime, within the next 30 to 60 years, is inevitable. The best case scenario isn't good enough. It's too late. But we've got a non-bleached coral here, same species, a bleached coral right here, growing right next to each other. That's very interesting, isn't it? Exact same conditions. This one's doing very poorly. May survive that bleaching, may ultimately die, but under that exact same stress, this individual is doing much better. That's just, there could be some potential for resilience there, some adaptation over time, some acclimatization, something like that. So that's where my interest really lies, is what's the difference between these? And can we go from a reef full of corals like this that bleach and die when we have some higher temperatures to a reef full of corals like this that survive that stress? So a project that I did, we got some pretty cool results from, which I'll describe in just a moment here. This is kind of where things started for the work that I've been doing for my PhD. For this particular project, we focused on 3 of our dominant reef building corals in Hawaii. That is rice coral here, finger coral, and lace coral, collected from 2 different locations. The first right around the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology in Kaneohe Bay, and the second off of Waimanalo here. So we're right here in Hanauma Bay. The reason we chose these sites is for totally natural reasons, differences in circulation, ocean circulation, things like that. Kaneohe Bay is naturally warmer than most places in Hawaii, and it's warmer like we expect average conditions to be in 30, 40, 50 years in the rest of Hawaii. So those conditions where most folks are projecting everything's supposed to be dead, that's every single year in Kaneohe Bay. And the reason it's warmer is very simple. It's a big shallow pool of water, so during the summertime, it gets a lot of sun, it heats up. Most parts of Hawaii are more like this reef in Waimanalo. They're more exposed and flushed by the open ocean, so they're a little bit cooler. For another set of reasons, we also have normal seawater chemistry here in most places. Within the bay, for slightly more complex reasons, we have low pH water, similar to what other Hawaiian reefs are going to see in the future. So this is effectively our reef of the future. And I had the question, well, we have corals here. We have lots of corals here. We have lots of corals here too. Even though most people would expect this should be too hot and too acidic for them, we still have lots of coral there. Maybe we're seeing some adaptation. Maybe we're seeing some acclimation to those conditions, and maybe these can help us to understand what might happen to reefs in Hawaii as the climate changes. So looking again at these 3 species, those are the ones we focused on, collected them, brought them into the lab, and exposed them to stress. In this case, temperature stress. Heat them up, see how they do. Without getting into a whole lot of data, just trust me that these figures are based on real data. I didn't just draw them. But for this species from our pool site, Waimanalo, like most Hawaiian reefs function right now, they've got this temperature tolerance distribution, so they're relatively sensitive. In Kaneohe Bay, much higher temperature tolerances. Same thing for our lace coral. Those are even more sensitive. It's a very sensitive species, but that's shifted in Kaneohe Bay. For this third species, finger coral, they have high temperature tolerances in Kaneohe Bay, but they have high temperature tolerances everywhere. So we don't see any shift in that species because it can deal with the temperature stress much better everywhere it lives. This is exactly what you would expect to see in order to allow them to survive in Kaneohe Bay, which they do, but it's also what you would expect to see in order for them to survive under a changing, in this case, a warming climate. So that's fantastic. If we look at their pH tolerances, how much lower pH seawater due to ocean acidification inhibits their growth, we see a different pattern, and this is very interesting to me. For our corals that are, in this case, both relatively temperature sensitive, they're much more tolerant to low pH. And I don't think those 2 things are necessarily associated. I think it's probably just quirks of these species, but maybe a little difference in distribution, but it's not statistically significant, quote unquote. So effectively the same tolerances for those guys. But for this really heat tolerant species, when it comes from an environment with higher pH, normal seawater chemistry, it is very sensitive to low pH. The ones from Kaneohe Bay are much more tolerant of that low pH, and in fact as tolerant as some of these other more tolerant species. And this is, in fact, the first example of in the world we know of a coral adapting to ocean acidification, which is really cool. So that's where it started. We see some potential out there. We see some potential, and that's really cool. Another project that we've been working on, we started last year in response to the bleaching that we had last year. And again, another of these classic photos. This comes from Kaneohe Bay, where we had extensive bleaching last year, and we had extensive coral bleaching this year. We've got a rice coral here. We've got a couple different individuals of finger coral, but again, right next to each other. Same species, severely bleached, and not bleached at all. So we want to understand, what are some of the details? I keep hitting the microphone, sorry guys. We want to understand some of the details of what makes those corals different. Why does this one bleach and why does this one not bleach? And ultimately, what are the long-term trajectories of those individual corals? So around Kaneohe Bay, we have both of these species, rice coral and finger coral, paired tagged individuals, paired like this, right next to each other, of individuals that bleached last year and individuals that did not bleach last year. When we tagged them, we took some examples. We were looking at recovery both in nature of those colonies and in aquarium experiments. Didn't realize at the time we were going to have another bleaching event in Hawaii this year. No one knew. There were no projections for this year's temperatures, but lo and behold, we've had an even more severe bleaching this year, in fact. And sure enough, the ones that bleached last year bleached again this year. The ones that didn't bleach last year didn't bleach again this year. And we saw exactly the same thing in our aquarium experiments under those natural temperature conditions. So that's exciting, because when you take this coral that doesn't bleach in the field, it wasn't just a quirk that it didn't bleach last year. It didn't bleach again this year in its natural home on the reef, and it didn't bleach in our aquariums. So there's some sort of heritable, consistent resilience that this coral has and this one doesn't. So again, it suggests there's potential there. Not saying everything will be hunky-dory, but there's potential there to shift from a reef full of these sorts of individuals to a reef dominated by those. And lastly, what we're working on very hard right now is we previously compared this Kaneohe Bay and this Waimanalo site using a few different species. We wanted to expand beyond this. So in Hawaii, we've got 50-ish species of shallow water coral. Out of those 50-ish, you've got these 8 species that are really the dominants. 98, 99% of the corals out on a reef are going to be one of these 8 species. So you'll occasionally find some less common other species, but most of them are going to be these. We're focusing on these species because if we know how they respond and what their potential is to adapt to climate change and to ocean acidification, we're going to have a really good idea of not just where these species, but of where the entire ecosystem in Hawaii is going, because these are the major reef builders. We're also sampling across a much broader gradient. So we've got natural gradients in temperature, in chemistry, and wave exposure. We want to get a much broader idea both across species and the range of habitats that these species grow in. What is the potential for these organisms to adapt or acclimatize to the warmer conditions and to the changing seawater chemistry? So this is going to end up being a long-term project. We're going to be running some experiments for a few years, but hopefully within the next few years, we should have really solid, very concrete ideas about where are reefs likely to go over the next few decades and what is the potential for these corals to survive, to make it through. I'd like to thank all the folks that have helped, and thank you all for coming in.
Okay, so we're going to open up a question and answer forum with our 2 speakers. Do you guys have any questions at this time?
So on the side-by-side corals, on the side-by-side coral, where one bleached and the other didn't bleach, how similar are they to their DNA? Are they similar genetically in a similar way or not genetically?
They're the same species, so they're...
I guess I'm saying, are there any genetic variations that you know of?
They're the same species, but clearly they're performing differently. And ultimately, their performance likely has something to do with genetic differences. What are the specific genetic differences, which is not the only mechanism, but it's likely that there are genetic differences underlying that. What are the specifics? We're working on figuring out right now. I can't tell you right now what we're working on.
I have a question about the graphs that you have, the herbicide graphs. Like, it started going back up and then it just went looking down.
One of these? Okay.
Like from the bottom, and it was going down and up.
So you had a period of more negative impacts which killed corals, and then just kind of by chance you can see here, what's actually particularly neat about this study is they were able to attribute a few major causes to this decline. So COTS is crown of thorns starfish. Those are starfish that eat corals. They can reach plague proportions when their larvae are fed like crazy from phytoplankton, which are grown by fertilizers coming from land. So when you get big storm of it, anyway, I'm getting on a tangent, but that has a big human signature. So if you've got a lot of cyclones, things like this producing a lot of rain, it tends to wash a lot more water and fertilizer out that drive bees. Cyclones, storm impacts, right? Coral bleaching. So just by chance, we had more impacts here, and things were a little bit better here. So this, to go back to normal levels of coral cover, if we just stopped hitting them for like 10, 20 years, maybe more like 20 years, this would come back. But it's just these constant assaults that keeps bringing them down. So in this particular case, they weren't getting assaulted as hard as often. Yes.
10 years ago, I went to Mexico to acquire Sedimentation or sunscreen outdoor. Use their biodegradable sunscreens. Do you have any information on how that is affecting our corals? Would it be worthwhile to do something like that here? Use a different type of sunscreen, or maybe just growing a long sleeve rash guard to keep it out of the water.
So there have been a variety of studies looking at sunscreen impacts on corals. Most of the older work I was very skeptical of and have a list of criticisms of. The major one being, well, if you incubate them with extremely, extremely ridiculously high concentrations, of course they don't like it, but who cares? That has nothing to do with what's happening out there in nature. Having said that, there was a paper published a week or two ago that found, I think it's oxybenzone, which is an ingredient in most sunscreens. Not every sunscreen, but most sunscreens is quite toxic to coral larvae and causes a lot of other problems. So it's quite toxic to them. And not only that, it's quite toxic to them at the concentrations that they measured in water samples at coral reefs around the world. So it looks like it may well be a real problem, but we don't have to put that ingredient in sunscreen to make it to work. It's a very common ingredient, but you can make effective sunscreens other ways. So something I think would be a wonderful idea would be if the state of Hawaii banned sunscreens that contain that ingredient. Because if you're coming here, we wouldn't necessarily ban tourists from bringing sunscreen from home that would have that, but not many are going to do that. Most are going to buy their sunscreen here, and if they just don't get that sunscreen with that nasty ingredient that's killing things, it would be a good idea. So that would be my take on that. It's not the best, but it's it's not particularly harmful for us, but it looks like it's really harmful to them. So, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
In your research, are you looking at soft costs and like raising process?
We're not here. We don't have very many soft coral species in Hawaii, and there's been some work on those. They're important, but they don't serve as critical an ecological role as a lot of stony corals. So I'm certainly very guilty of focusing on those charismatic mesofauna. Because without them building the reef, everything else doesn't work. There's no ecosystem, nothing else can live there if they're not building it. Having said that, some detail that I didn't get into with that last piece of the project is we are focused very heavily on the corals, and that was kind of the story I was telling you today, but we're going to be looking through that project at biodiversity, community structure, recruitment, a whole bunch of other stuff, because the other than a few species of coral and a few other calcifying critters, the other 99% of biodiversity on a coral reef, we have no clue. We've never investigated in any way how they respond, because you can only do so much, and there are thousands and thousands of species, so folks often focus on the, what we perceive as the very important ones, but we want to get an idea. And if we have soft coral show up, that will be great.
I liked your map of all the interrelated factors in water, and it seemed like what you've got is kind of a preliminary relationship between the factors. I wondered if you talk to people in the government, tourism, and agriculture, and you're saying, if you guys change this and this and this, we're going to have a little more water to work with and their responses.
Mhm.
Have you talked to them and
Oh,
how they responded to your research?
right. So it goes like the initial interviews actually are one-to-one. So I have already selected and talked to a few of them, although I haven't shown here the results from, for example, from Commission on Water Resources Management. So I am asking them, okay, from management point of view, how are you going to allocate them? What are the components you see fit in your perception that are going to be affected by climate and land use change? What are the causal relationships between them? Then I also have some people I know from conservation, for example, from West Maui Mountain Alliance Partnership. So I also have some people who are doing cultural practitioners in West Maui, quite a few of them. I haven't talked to them yet, but I've already reached out to them and they've agreed to come to me. So those are, and then also, I'm missing one, agri farmers. So in West Maui, most of them are, well, there is a small patch of coffee, but there is in central, in the Yao Valley, there are quite a few more than coffee. So those are the people I've already reached out to them, and some of them have already applied to me that they would like to be, interviewed and give their perceptions on how they have handled in the past when they had these events and how they're going to handle in the future.
Are you doing modeling? I don't know, less now it's groundwater, but are you doing modeling as surface water's effect on groundwater or just
That's a good question. So the modeling that I'm doing is a surface water model. Of course, surface water interacts with groundwater. So I'm not modeling per se, but in my methods, when I'm asking questions, I would be asking them, especially when it comes to management, we do use 99.7% of groundwater for domestic purposes in 2010, according to USGS. So I would be asking questions, how are you, managing in terms of, okay, when you have this much development going on in this area, how planning to meet that demand? Where are we going to actually extract that groundwater to meet that demand? That type of question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm a boat captain and I interface with the people taking them out on the water. So at the beginning of the day, I kind of give them a boat briefing and tell them about the boat and stuff. And then during the day, sometimes I have the opportunity to talk to them about the ocean a little bit. And I was just wondering from both you guys, like if you had like a minute to talk to 20 people or 100 people, like what the tidbits would you want to put in their head about water conservation and about conservation of corals? Just like what you can do, like we talk about sunscreen.
Right.
So you want to stay away from occidental.
Right.
Water resource management. I know it's a little bit off, but I mean obviously conservation.
Yeah. So you're talking about boat tours.
It's just so many people come here on vacation.
Right.
Enjoy it. But now it's getting to the point where we also have to talk about conservation.
So I think for local folks particularly, the major problem for Hawaiian reefs, not the only problem, but the major problem for Hawaiian reefs specifically up to this point has been poor land use practices, particularly sedimentation. So, I mean, like you've got so many beautiful reefs on Maui and Molokai, especially on Molokai. There's this section where it's just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous reef and then dead, absolutely dead for a section and covered in mud. Doesn't take that much silt to do it. So that's a local problem that we can solve locally by keeping all the dirt and sediment and such on the land, not washing into the ocean. They've actually taken really important steps over the last few years in Hanauma Bay, off of Hawaii, Honolulu. They've taken important steps to improve water quality there. It's not going to be fixable overnight. This is decades of neglect that aren't going to be fixed overnight, but it can improve the situation dramatically. So that's a major threat. It has not been a problem as much recently, but it's going to become a building problem and getting much more serious really fast. Climate change. Switching the light bulb in your house is a great idea to do a more energy efficient one, but we've let this problem fester for too long. We're not going to solve it by doing that. We need politicians who are going to make it illegal to not solve the problem. Legal mandates, period. So that's what we need to do. You need to vote for the right people. You need to talk to other people about who you're voting for and make it a political issue. I'm not suggesting who you should vote for, but that needs to be a political issue that we solve because we've let it go for so long. If we don't get on the ball really fast here, it's going to be game over.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on conservation. So for example, you can also do like locally, like individual homes, they can actually improve, sort of having impervious, concrete layer, they can actually include like rain gardens. Rain garden is basically, you have these small little gardens where, and also instead of having a paved area, you would rather have, a grassy area. And probably not the turf kind, but the regular kind, with the turf kind, you have to actually feed pesticides and stuff, where we have, these pesticides flowing into the groundwater. So those are the little things we can do at home, individually, and it can improve, and if we do it together, yeah.
It kind of decreases the sedimentation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything you could do to improve land-based water quality is also going to improve your coastal ocean water quality. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. They feed on each other, absolutely.
One other big problem is septic tanks and manholes. So people can actually pay attention to maintaining them. So if you can maintain them, they can last for quite a while. But most of the people, they don't maintain them, and people live along the coastline, so they go very easily, very quickly into the ocean, and it has a huge problem along the coastline.
Question, you have all these people here, and groundwater, I don't know if they have wells built there, or it's all rain, and all fresh water that comes in from on the mountain, is that, or did they drill it? And do you get the water out of the groundwater to stay on the street, or do they have a desalination plant here or something?
Okay, groundwater it comes from also both places actually. The dike system, we do have a lot of fresh water, as well as we bottled water supply. They also have specific groundwater pumping wells. I don't have the map yet, but they do have both. So in the mountains where you are talking about is basically the dike system. You know, the dike systems are the tubes that in the mountains, when the lava flows, freezes, it creates like tube-like structures. And when rainwater flows in, water stays fresh in those dike system. And so in Oahu, we do have, I don't want to say 50, around 40 or 50% of fresh water actually comes from the dike system. So I've been there in one of my class trips.
I'm just amazed that there's so many people here, and every time you think of something as simple as somebody flushing a toilet, okay, there's millions of people. And they say, how long can it last? So, thank you.
In terms of desalination, we do have a few programs, but it's very costly. So it's imagine you will have to pay about $20 a bottle of water. Yeah.